Hi, welcome to Law&Crime Report. My name is Bob Bianchi. You'll be taking it for the next hour. I hope you're all having a great Monday. Let's start off with Andre Hill. He was shot and killed by former police officer Adam Coy. Adam Coy has been indicted by a grand jury, and he was appearing at his arraignment and has pled not guilty. The judge set a $3 million bond. The defense was asking for a $250,000 bond. This was a case that occurred when 911 calls were made to police officers. They responded to the scene as the victim was coming out and from behind a car. There's kind of an angle from the body camera, which had not initially been turned on, but was later turned on, that kind of blocked the vision of the officer. The officer yelled out, "He's got a gun, he's got a gun," to another officer, shot, fired, and killed him. There was no gun at the scene. Let's listen to the Attorney General as they explain the charges now this former officer faces.
After a brief interaction with the man, Andre Hill, Officer Coy stated that he thought he saw a gun in Hill's right hand and fired his service weapon, killing Hill. He was 47 years old. No weapon was found on the scene. The Ohio Bureau of Investigation and Identification, a division of the Ohio Attorney General's office, performed the investigation at the request of the city of Columbus. BCI's investigation, including the process of the crime scene, gathering and evaluating evidence, reviewing body cam footage, and analyzing cyber data, as well as interviewing witnesses, including the officers involved in the incident. BCI's investigation is typically turned over when it is complete to the prosecutor having jurisdiction. The prosecutor, in turn, makes a presentation to the grand jury, which makes the decision about whether or not to indict an individual. As an independent fact finder, BCI's investigators only present the facts. They do not determine whether an officer's use of force is justified. Today, the Franklin County Grand Jury indicted Mr. Coy on the following charges: murder and the commission of a felony, that felony being felonious assault, a separate charge of felonious assault, one count of dereliction of duty based on Mr. Coy's failure to engage his body camera, and one count of dereliction of duty based on his failure to inform his fellow officer that he felt that Mr. Hill presented a danger. The grand jury was also instructed on purposeful murder under Ohio law, and they issued a no bill as to that charge. Coy was arrested earlier this evening on these charges. He will have his initial appearance in court tomorrow. A bail hearing will be conducted at that time. Law enforcement officers are held in high regard because of their sacrifice, their courage, their service to our communities. They undertake the increasingly difficult and dangerous task of protecting our communities. But every person is responsible for and judged by his or her own actions. Neither guilt nor virtue may be inferred simply by association.
Okay, so there's a prosecutor in the case talking about that indictment. Let me bring in our great guest that we have today. Bernarda Villalona is a senior child counselor at the Joey Jackson Law Firm in New York, and she previously worked in the Philly and Brooklyn Kings County DA's office with over 100 trials, including numerous homicide cases, and was a senior homicide ADA and is a TV legal analyst. And my boy, Mike Koribanics, we started together as baby prosecutors. He is a former prosecutor. We worked in the same office, and he is certified by the New Jersey Supreme Court as a certified criminal trial attorney. Only 250 out of 98,000 lawyers, God help us, have such a distinction like that. And he is also a Law&Crime analyst. Welcome to the show, guys. Bernarda, I want to toss to you on this. Serious charges. You're a former homicide prosecutor. Talk to our audience a little bit about what the prosecutor was saying, that there was a presentation of a purposeful murder charge, but it was no build. What does that mean exactly?
So what's important to remember here that, of course, what the Attorney General is saying is that a crime did take place. And as a result of a crime taking place, an investigation took place. As a result of an investigation taking place, the prosecutor presented the facts, the case, to a grand jury. The grand jury was the one to determine whether this officer should be indicted, meaning whether he should be held over for trial. Because the grand jury made a decision that there was enough evidence at a lower burden for this officer to face charges, that's how he is indicted. There was a true bill. What is very important to note from the presentation of this attorney general is that he said that the charge of purposeful homicide was presented to the grand jury. That means that this officer intended to cause the death of Andre Hill. That charge was presented to the grand jury, and that grand jury determined that there should be a no true bill. This officer did not intend to kill Andre Hill. Instead, they held him over on the charge of murder when a felonious assault took place, meaning that he intended for the assault to take place, but not for the death to take place. Instead, that a death resulted as a result of his actions.
Excellent description of the distinctions, and they have huge implications in terms of sentencing. But Bernarda, why do I get a feeling, I don't know, when you were talking and you were talking about how the prosecutor presented this case, that you're kind of maybe thinking that's exactly what did not go on in the Breonna Taylor case.
Exactly. And that's why I need the audience to know this is exactly how a prosecution should take place. It is important for the community, for there to be any trust in the criminal justice system, that there is transparency. And for there to be transparency, the attorney general, the prosecutor must present the facts and the process to the people of the county, of the state. And in determining that, in order for there to be transparency and trust in the criminal justice system, you present the case to the grand jury, for the grand jury to make a determination whether there should be any charges and what those charges should be. And you present all of the facts, all of the evidence, because the grand jury is the fact finder, not the prosecutor, not the attorney general, but the grand jurors.
Despite the fact, Mike Koribanics, that the prosecutor has a tremendous amount of control over what goes on in a grand jury, because it's only one side is there, and the manner in which they present evidence has a big effect on how grand jurors will respond. Mike, I want to go to you real quick to the bail issue here. A $3 million bail. The defense argued here that the client was not a flight risk. That is a factor to be considered in a bail, that it's a self-defense case, and that it's about the level of force versus prosecutors who were seeking a very high bail. The defense was asking for a $250,000 bail. Mike, those are the considerations that judges take when they're deciding what an appropriate amount of bail is. A $3 million bail is virtually impossible to make. Was that a fair call by the judge who, when challenged, just said it is what it is, basically?
Judge, Bob,
That's
probably
right.
one day
That's
to
right.
become a judge, Bob. I'm not starting a rumor. You know, Bob, it's something I think we always speak about, and it's very difficult from the defense point of view, because I always said, you know, a lot of times the judge, luckily New Jersey has changed from monetary bail. But, you know, when they set a bail at $1 million, you say, what's the difference between $1 million and $3 million? From a defense point of view, I think this could be a very, very high bail, and considered one, considering that it's not a question of guilt or innocence. At this point in time, there's a presumption of innocence, and there's just really a flight risk or risk to commit another offense. That appears, unless they have something in his background, not to be a real danger here, so it may be an excessive bail.
Yeah, Bernarda, I kind of feel that way too. As criminal defense attorneys now, we all, having gone from that place of the prosecutors to criminal defense lawyering, it seems to me that in cases of publicity, these things are occurring with these exorbitant bails. In my mind, this was an exorbitant bail. And a lot of people may say, especially on the criminal justice side, well, he deserves it. He's a cop. He did a bad thing. But you know what? This has rippling repercussions for all of those other defendants that aren't as notorious as this particular case and the other cases in terms of getting bails like this too. And like Mike said, you want to talk about criminal justice reform, Bernarda, I have 2 points. In Jersey, every case where a cop is involved in a fatality is presented to the grand jury as the charges. Everyone, there are no exceptions, period, end of story. That's the way it goes. And two, our bail is no longer a cash bail system, but it's based on risk factors and a scoring system. What do you think about all of that and the bail in particular here?
So one, I do give credit and I do love that for New Jersey, all cases involving the death where a police officer is involved is presented to the grand jury. So I think that definitely helps out in building trust in the system. Now, in regards to bail, obviously the number one purpose of setting bail is to guarantee the person's presence at each and every court date. That is the purpose of bail, the number one purpose of bail. What amount was secured that this person, if they make bail, will definitely come back to court on each and every court date because they don't want to lose that money. So that is the importance of bail. And I believe that when it comes to money, people don't want to lose money. So bail should be set, but at a reasonable amount, especially when you're talking about a homicide. Now, when we're talking about nonviolent cases, I am all for that there shouldn't be crash bail, but that should be determined on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, well, we'll see if people will come to the aid of this police officer to make that bail like they did Kyle Rittenhouse, because that seems to be the way things are going in today's day. But I agree, there's no flight risk here. That bail, in my mind, was just done for the court of public opinion. Anyway, let's go to a clip of Coy's defense attorney and what his thoughts are with respect to the charges that have been filed and now indicted by the grand jury.
Mr. Hill was not compliant with some verbal orders that my client gave. And then my client ordered him to show his hands and come out. And then when he came near the car, Mr. Hill came near the car, his right hand was down low. My client couldn't see it. His left hand was up high with a cell phone in it. So as soon as Mr. Hill came across outside of the bumper of the car, my client saw a round silver object in Mr. Hill's hand, and he honestly believed that that was a silver revolver. That's when he announced gun, 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 step back, and in protocol and shot.
You have to view it through the eyes of a reasonable police officer. That is the objective standard that Graham v. Connor dictates, but the subjective standard is that the officer must be in fear for his life. And yes, that's what we're saying, that Adam Coy was in fact in fear for his life, that when he saw Mr. Hill's left hand come up with the phone, he was focused on his right hand. And at the time when his right hand came up, he believed that it was a revolver. And because of that, that's when he made that split-second decision to shoot.
You know, Mike, I'm a cop supporter, and you know, certainly I agree, and the grand jury did too, that he did not go out there that day to kill this gentleman. But I'm curious about your thoughts. When you look at that video and you listen to even the description of the defense attorneys, it just isn't good enough that you think you saw something that's not there. It almost reminds me of that Casino movie. Remember, the guy pulls out the sub sandwich and they shoot and kill the guy? I mean, you're supposed to be trained in these things, and the reality is the guy did not have a weapon. So this self-defense claim, when the lawyer talks about objectively reasonable, talk to our audience about what that means with regard, why she used that term with regard to self-defense.
Well, because, Bob, objectively means this is going to probably come down to a battle of the experts should this case go to trial. Those experts being what a reasonable police officer objectively means, that it isn't individualized to what that specific officer was thinking. It's a reasonable officer from across the board of training of police officers in that situation would have acted and how he would have acted. If I researched this correctly, Bob, I believe there was also a question here of the body cam being either on or off and when exactly it went on, which gives us a little bit of a problem here as to how to evaluate why that wasn't on as it should be. And that also is going to have further ripple effects in any trial.
Yeah, Bernarda, your thoughts on the idea that objective reasonableness requires essentially what would an objectively reasonable police officer, like Mike just said, have done under those similar circumstances? You were a former homicide prosecutor. Now you're a defense lawyer. If you were defending him, I think you're going to have a hard time finding that expert. And if you do, that expert, in my mind, is going to get destroyed on cross-examination by the prosecutors.
I agree. There's going to be a problem trying to find an expert that's going to take the side of this former officer. What is going to be necessary in this case is that Adam Coy is going to have to take the stand, because in order for you to convince this jury that what you did was reasonable given the circumstances, and also to convey how was it that you felt, what was going on in your mind, what was it that you thought you saw, the jury can only hear that from you, because you were the person that was at the scene. You were the person that pulled the trigger. And unfortunately, because your body camera was off, you can't even show that through the body camera, through video footage. That at that point, video footage would assisted the jury to be able to put themselves in the spot of this police officer. And unfortunately, he took that one defense, that crucial piece of evidence, away from the jury.
All right, excellent analysis, guys. As always, as you guys know, inmates in St. Louis had a revolt at the jail. It was really quite extraordinary. We're going to be talking about that on the other end of the break. Stay with us. Just speaking with my guests offline before we came on, I guess we can entitle "What is Happening in Rochester." So we got inmates in St. Louis, however, before we get to that were involved in a revolt of broken windows, fire, flooded areas, extensive damage, throwing chairs out windows. This occurred on Saturday about 2:30 a.m. and was not quelled by law enforcement authorities until about 10 o'clock that same morning. Apparently, one quote-unquote defined inmate got into an altercation with a corrections officer, and a bunch of other inmates jumped in on this. Now, before I get to my guest, I have got to read this to you guys. The director of the facility indicated that it was because of faulty facilities are partially to blame. Listen to this. Listen to what he's telling us some of the faulty facility is. Ability to jimmy locks, that the prisoner inmates were able to do that, locks that don't work, and an automated panel system that shows that the doors are locked when in fact they aren't. Mike Koribanics, me and you were literally involved as baby prosecutors in a very similar incident where we overlooked through the window as the jail was on fire and they were throwing fire out and screaming and yelling at the prosecutors as we were walking by. They're a very frightening, scenario, and it took them a while to take this down. But that was an old, antiquated jail. This is the third incident that's happened, which we'll get to in a minute, in that jail in recent months. But can you believe, for the life of you, that they're telling you that they were new and were aware that prisoners were able to jimmy locks, the lock systems didn't work, and that the panel misread? Well, why even have a panel? Mike, what were your thoughts when you were reading this?
I had to read it a couple times, quite frankly, Bob. In this day and age, going through a pandemic, where you're hearing about outbreaks in jail, the safety of inmates, and things of that nature, people are at their wits' end. We're hearing about mental breakdowns for people who are living in a world not in a jail, things like this, where people are confined and things of that nature. But to have where people could jimmy locks when you're trying to quarantine and there's spread, not to mention what happened here with the violence, it's almost unbelievable in this day and age, Bob. It's just, there has to be an investigation as to what allowed this to occur and how it went on so long.
Yeah, Mike, absolutely. And you bring up a really good point. Being in my home, I have a living room, a dining room, bedrooms, a gym downstairs, which I don't use as much as I should. I got all sorts of places.
Oh, who are you kidding, Bob? You use it all the time.
I can do all these things, but can you imagine being contained in a facility where you're in close quarters of other people? This pandemic is going on. The prisoners, they always said you find out about society, about how you treat your prisoners. There was a state representative, Rasheen Aldridge Jr., who said that these quote unquote protests, he called them, was due to the inhumane treatment of the inmates during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also there were signs that some of you folks may have seen that said Free 57. Free 57, Bernarda, is a reference to over 50 inmates who were put in solitary confinement for bringing to light in December the issues of COVID and the problems in the jail. So how do we look at this as a society? Do we look at this as that this is a rightful protest and a revolt, or do we look at this as inmates that have gotten out of control and should be severely penalized for it?
So the problem is that there are problems on both sides. There are problems for the inmates as well as for the correction officers. Unfortunately, this incident here is not one that is isolated to that city, because we have those same types of conditions here in New York. Here in New York City, unfortunately, at Rikers Island, the correction officers are forced to work under these conditions that are deplorable. You have cells that don't lock. You have faulty locks. They're understaffed where they have to care for these inmates when it's 40 of them, 40 inmates, and there's only 2 correction officers to man for those 40 inmates. These conditions are going on all around the country, and it's something that is not spoken of from the vantage point of the correction officers and their safety, and also of the inmates, because you hear of the violence of inmates slashing correction officers. You hear them throwing feces and also urine on the correction officers. You hear the correction officers being forced to work double time, triple time, and forced to have to stay in those conditions and not able to walk out, because if they do walk out and decide that they can't work a double shift or a triple shift, they can be brought up on administrative charges. Change has to take place, but it has to be from both sides, from the Department of Corrections as well as from the inmates, because the violence is at an all-time high. The conditions for the correction officers is just not safe for them. They are expected to be perfect in a situation that is imperfect.
Spoken truly by somebody who represents corrections officers in the state of New York, a significant amount of them, up to 8,000. So you know what you're talking about, Bernarda. And Mike, to her point, there were about 115 inmates that were involved. And the director referred to these defendants as very, quote, angry, defiant, very violent people that have serious high-level felony offenses. And so to Bernarda's point, though, Mike, our experience shows us that these officers are between a rock and a hard place. They've got to deal with short staffing, improper training, do more with less, more and more inmates, less and less corrections officers, and a group of people who are angry and frustrated for the situation that they're in. Pile on to that a pandemic, and you've got a match, to literally to a flame here that caused the fires and the flooding and all that acting out. Mike, I don't see any way to get to Bernarda's point of correcting this unless there's an overhaul in the mentality of society that we have to make sure these corrections officers are fully staffed and that the bad corrections officers are removed as quickly as possible, because that's another problem the good corrections officers face. They're between the criminals and the bad corrections officers, and their life is on the line.
It's a horrible situation, Bob, and there's no simple solutions to complex problems. However, we know one of the roots here by scientific data, by psychological studies, is solitary confinement does not work. It has never worked. It does not ease situations. It does not protect situations. This is at the root of solitary confinement, and I believe it inflames situations both physically and mentally, and that's a problem. And I think that's the first step they have to take, as well as better disciplining and training of corrections officers. And also, Bob, there needs to be more assistance to corrections officers and inmates from a psychological standpoint, so that we can have professionals in the mental health field who could help solve these problems rather than just trying to meet violence with violence.
You guys remember Daniel Prude out of Rochester. As I said, we were going to get to some issues that are going on there, and not just this case in this show. The police chief who resigned and then was fired for the response. This is the case in which the officers, there's a mental health disturbance call, put a spit sock on the individual's face, Daniel Prude's face, had him in a prone position, and he eventually died a week later from brain damage and had stopped breathing at that scene. So the officer, the chief, was talking during a deposition because the family has sued the police department and said that he did not see anything that was egregious at all with regard to, there were no punches, there was no striking. Let's listen to the mayor as they discuss what this case is all about.
Mr. Daniel Prude was failed by our police department, our mental health care system, our society, and he was failed by me. And I stand here against the advice of our corporation counsel, but I would not be who I am today had I not if I don't stand on my own truth. I must apologize to the Prude family and to all of our community.
All right, guys, I want to add two, I think, salient and important facts about this case that we're learning. A report indicated that 300 pages of emails and police reports were reviewed, an independent investigation, and they found that one of the reports had edits on it where Mr. Prude's name was listed as a victim, but then it was circled in red, and they changed that to with a note that said, make him a suspect. Okay, so that's number one. So there's some creative report writing. Somebody writes he's a victim, some supervisor, because that's what happens in my mind, circled it and writes literally in a handwritten note, no, make him the suspect. Okay. And then also this interesting medical examiner evaluation, because as prosecutors in a murder case, you have to show cause and manner of death. And the medical examiner said it was a homicide and opined that it was due to asphyxia in a physical restraint, excited delirium, and acute PCP intoxication. The family is indicating that he was acutely manic and psychotic at the time of the incident. Bernarda, what are your sense about these police officers and what they did? They go to a 911 disturbance. They're not mental health counselors. They didn't have any mental health people available that were at the scene. He's obviously under PCP and an excited delirium. Nobody's disputing that. 911 is called there. They're worried about getting spit on, so the spit sock is not an unusual tactic. He was taken down to the ground, apparently not in a very forceful way. Nevertheless, based on the constellation of reasons the medical examiner gave for death, they are now being called to the carpet with regard to Mr. Prude's demise. That makes it kind of a hard case based on how the medical examiner wrote it up, don't you think?
So when you listen to the manner and cause of death, obviously it does equal out to being a homicide. But when you look at the video, and you also know the background of this victim, this complainant, it's hard not to look and see, what did the cops do? Why did they respond in the way that they did? How is it that they responded in that way and not take into account the mental condition? Because these officers did know when they were responding to the location that this person did have some mental issues. The problem is, as we see all around the country, is that these police officers, when they respond to incidents, when you have a person that's suffering some kind of mental health issue, is that they are not equipped to handle them, to approach them in an appropriate manner where it doesn't equal out to some sort of injury, and here, unfortunately, death.
Mike, what about, I tell you, I'm really disturbed about this whole idea of changing this report. I mean, it's hard enough to assess cases like this without having game playing going on with how you write it up. Can you believe this?
Bob, it's almost unbelievable. It's unbelievable that there would be such a, it just goes right to the credibility of any investigation when you're supposed to write reports, not scripts. We live in the real world. We're not here to make facts that change out, because not only is it just hurt this situation, that's why things progress. That's why these cases get worse, because if we don't be truthful and evaluate fairly the facts as they are, we're not going to correct them in the future. We're just going to make them worse.
Mike, I as prosecutor would consider filing official misconduct charges for something like this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. There should be another investigation.
Right. Bernarda, what are your thoughts about that creative police report? Right. I like how Mike puts it. It's supposed to be a report about the facts, not a script.
I agree, because it taints the whole entire investigation. It taints how these officers responded. So if you think about it, you watch the video and then you later hear, oh, wait, they saw some report, and the report, there were changes in the language of the report. Then to me, it's some form of consciousness of guilt that I would argue that these officers were wrong, and that's why they changed the language in the report. So not only will they should face some type of criminal charges for changing the report, we also know that they should face administrative charges for their actions with having to deal with the report.
Yeah, excellent point. Consciousness of guilt, showing the fact that they changed it because they knew that what they had in there did not make them look good. Excellent commentary, guys. Appreciate it. But that's not all we have in Rochester. How about a 9-year-old that's pepper sprayed and handcuffed? We'll get to that on the other end of the break. We're back in Rochester again, where the mayor is vowing police reform after a 9-year-old, 9 years old, was pepper sprayed and handcuffed by police because she wasn't putting her feet in a police car as they were trying to put her inside the vehicle. So we got a situation here that's pretty bad. Let's watch the clip of this, but we warn you in advance, it is extremely disturbing.
You're not going to run away from me, okay? Because I'm going to have to chase you, okay? And I got like 6 other cars coming to chase you.
I don't care.
All right?
I don't care.
Well, come and talk to me, please.
No, I don't want to.
Let's go have a seat.
No, I want my dad.
You're not going to run off.
I want my dad.
Yes, you're going to be fine.
Stop.
I want my dad. I'm not getting in no car until I see my dad.
Here, just stop for a second.
I want my dad.
Control 47, I'm in there.
I want my dad. No.
Stop. Don't kick us, dear.
Stop! Wait, can I just please get the snow off of me?
I'll get the snow off you.
It's cold.
Get in the car.
You've had your chance.
Get in the car now.
Okay?
Okay?
You've had your chances.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
I want
Because you're going to go to jail now, too.
You're up.
Stop!
Sit up.
No!
You're acting like a child.
I want to go.
Stop.
I am a child.
I'm gonna go get him. Now sit back. Come on. I will fix it. I will fix it.
If we need to, why don't we separate him outside?
Let's just sit back.
I want to see my dad.
Come on. Please sit back. Sit back. Come on. Put your legs together. It's your last chance.
Just spray her.
No, I have
Just
a
spray
dad
her at this
more.
point. Dear. I got her. I got her. Yeah.
Please wipe my eye. Wipe my eye, please.
Unbelievable.
Bernarda, what led to this? What could possibly justify in your mind this kind of action?
There's no justification for the actions that this officer took to actually pepper spray a 9-year-old girl, a 4th grader, in her eyes and handcuffed her. For what reason? For what reason? She did not commit a crime. She wasn't being arrested. She wasn't called. There was no imminent threat, imminent danger to the officers, to herself, or anyone else in that immediate area. There is no justification for this. Unfortunately, these cops, they failed this 9-year-old girl, and her mother also failed this 9-year-old girl, because there is additional footage where the mother is saying all these type of nasty things to this 9-year-old girl, her daughter, in the presence of these police officers. So supposedly the dad had been stabbed by the mother, and someone called 911, and the 9-year-old was reacting to seeing her dad bleeding out from, I believe, his stomach area. But either way, this 9-year-old girl, she wasn't a threat to anyone and should not have been sprayed in her eyes with pepper spray or handcuffed and forced into a police vehicle. There was no rationale for that. Unacceptable.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, this is a child, and to Bernarda's point, who is not accused of having committed any crime, who had witnessed her father being stabbed and is begging, I want to see my father, I want my dad, I want my dad. I mean, obviously, you would know that a child is going to be in a traumatic situation like that, not to mention that there's probably a little touch of distrust of the police in the first place. And then there's another officer at one point that I found curious saying to somebody must have been giving them a hard time, saying, you're going to go to jail too, which would communicate to this young lady that she's going to go to jail. I can't make any sense of this, no matter how I add it up. And all these other officers are just standing around when this is going on. Nobody's interceding.
Bob, this is one of the few times I am absolutely speechless. I can't even go into the deepest creativity in my criminal defense mind to justify any position of this. I mean, to be touching a 9-year-old child who just saw her father get stabbed and then threaten him with jail. I thought we really need to listen to some of the background comments, like telling a 9-year-old to stop acting like a child. Then the 9-year-old educates the police officer by telling her, I am a child. I mean, that should have been thought about before they even got out of the car. This is very upsetting. This is absolutely disgusting. And this is what they talk about, training, mental health training, and having mental health experts present on the scene. But I think in this instance, there needs to be mental health experts for the officers involved that even got it near this. And someone saying, just spray. I thought I heard one of the officers say, just spray her already. And then she says, she's handcuffed and says, can somebody wipe my eyes? This is a child. This is unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it was said so casually and matter of fact. Bernarda, one of the things in the use of force continuum is the escalation of force. And this is for suspects, may I add, and adults. And one of them is physical contact before you go to mechanical tools like pepper spray. This is a 9-year-old girl. And I'm not saying if you had to get her into that vehicle for some reason, whatever that reason is, even though she witnessed a horrible thing with regard to her father, you could get her legs into that car just as easily by using physical force rather than using mechanical force, pepper spray, and things of that nature. So it's just an over-escalation, in my mind, at least is how we're trained here in Jersey, and not every place is the same. But I can't imagine that the department condones this. In fact, the mayor is now trying to propose these reforms where the mayor says that from this point forward, juveniles under 12 years of age, they are not to be handcuffed unless they are an imminent danger to themselves or others, although imminent is not defined. Sounds like a pretty good rule, although I don't want to prohibit police officers from violent juveniles from being able to protect themselves.
But it's something that you should already know. Here you're dealing with, again, this is a 9-year-old girl who has not committed a crime. Instead, she is a victim. She is an eyewitness, and you have her handcuffed and you're pushing her into a police vehicle. For her to comprehend everything that is going on, that is so above her. All she knows about police officers is what she's seen in the past or what she sees in the news. In the end, if a police officer cannot control a 9-year-old child who is not with a weapon, who is not doing anything wrong, how can we expect these police officers to have any kind of handle or control on any other situation out in the streets? If you can't control a 9-year-old child and you have to resort to using pepper spray, then you shouldn't be on the force.
Well said, Bernarda. Now, Mike, their notice of claim has been filed. If you could explain to our audience what that means as a precursor to a civil suit. You know, this is technically a seizure of this young lady, and then, of course, an assault of her. I see it as a pretty good civil rights case. Talk to us a little about the civil rights aspect.
Well, what we call it in New Jersey is a tort claim notice. Basically, it's telling the governmental entity that we believe there was some wrongdoing by your whatever department it is, in this case, the police department. It gives them basically time. It's supposed to give them time to fairly evaluate the situation and see if there were any rights violations and see if that matter could be resolved prior to costing the taxpayers more money in a civil suit to defend. And if you ultimately lose in this matter, I assume this is going to be a pretty high settlement number in damages, because what does a 9-year-old do for the rest of their life every time they see a police car? Can you imagine every time you see a police car, if you have to reflect on this? That's a long life to live with that burden.
I bet you it's a lot more than a police car. My bet is Rochester wants this out of its hair because it's a public relations nightmare. In this case, we'll settle quickly. Guys, we're going to take a quick break, but we're going to come back on the other end with the Asian community in Oakland, California, where elderly people are repeatedly being attacked for hate crimes. Talk about that on the other side. All right, the Asian community under attack in Oakland. We have a really bad situation here where over, I think it's 20 people in the last couple of months have been attacked, or the last couple of weeks. The $25,000 reward is now being given by actors Daniel Day Kim and Daniel Wu, who are taking a stand against the rising tide of hate crimes against these people who are elderly, one of which was a 91-year-old man who was attacked on January 31st, 2021. I'm going to throw to a clip of a social media showing the attack of the 91-year-old man maybe you have some information because the police are trying to develop suspects. Okay, guys, I mean, you can't, Bernarda, look at that as anything other than a hate crime. He goes after this elderly man, pushes him down, doesn't try to take anything. It's not a robbery. There's no relationship between these individuals. What is happening in this world where people would do that? And I guess maybe where I come from, and I may be a little bit old school, you want to fight a fair one. Square out for somebody your own size, your own whatever, and do what you got to do, if that's even acceptable. But this is just, see, as a prosecutor, this would really get me PO'd.
You know, these are the cases that makes you want to be a prosecutor, to prosecute someone who can be so cold and callous to prey upon the elderly and push a 91-year-old man down to the ground and continue walking. That man unprovoked, not doing anything to you, and you just throw that person down to the ground. Come on, unacceptable, unacceptable. Unfortunately, trying a hate crime case, you're going to have to prove that the reason that the man pushed a 91-year-old man down was because of his race, his origin. So it's going to be difficult in that regard. But just for the assault itself, this is uncalled for.
Mike, you know, I couldn't help but think when I was reading the story that's happened to so many people now, so many elderly people that this is going on, that is it part of the political dialogue? Is it part of the pandemic and the virus and the blaming of a group of people for bringing that over here? Is this the thing that's a tipping point that's making these people now? I mean, we're hearing it throughout the country that they're being victimized or being yelled at and screamed at. Is this all part of it?
Bob, I think there's very strong facts and very strong inclinations to seem that this is a very strong part of it. In our hopes, we hope it's not, because we're all human beings. We're in a pandemic. We need to help one another. These are so dangerous to be targeting a person who's 90 years old. You know, if you push this person, he's got to go to the hospital. That means he's going to be at risk for COVID. At 91, we basically know that's a death sentence. If you catch COVID, it's very, very scary at that age, and it's putting our healthcare workers in danger. This is horrible. It's horrible, and once again, it's something that really defies logic.
Bernarda, what do you think about this political dialogue? Because this is also the kind of thing that reminded me when we interned the Japanese in internment camps during World War II. These were Americans. These were people that had their family members that were fighting in the war on our behalf. And yet the public gets put into a frenzy, and enemies identified by being a group of people, not dissimilar to what Hitler did by identifying Jewish people as a group of people, and then really bad things happen. Do you think that the political dialogue surrounding COVID and some of the unfortunate comments that were made by our leaders may be contributing to this?
So you got to think that the narrative is really what controls the actions and what's on TV, what's given to the public, what's in the mind of the public. Unfortunately, we had a so-called leader, our former president, number 45, who actually instilled in the minds of many individuals, many communities, that the cause of the COVID coming into our country was, as he would say, from China. For some reason, he says it weird, but he always pointed the finger at China and wanted people to look at those people from that area in a different light, because according to him, that's where the virus came from. Here you have information being provided by your leader, your former leader, and people are acting upon it. Again, we don't know why this took place, but what we do know is what took place. And we have a 91-year-old being thrown to the ground and left on the ground, helpless.
Mike, this reward that these actors are ponying up with the $25,000 in 15 seconds or less, do you think that's going to be helpful, or do we need more?
Well, I hope it's helpful. It's sorry that we need any amount of money, because we're a society and a community, and I give kudos to those who are putting up these rewards to bring attention to it.
Agreed. Mike, excellent point. Guys, you were excellent guests. Please stay tuned for our regularly scheduled program. You can find me at Bianchi ESQ. Have a great week.